Cacao House. The project focuses on cacao, an ingredient which has for thousands of years been central to ceremonies and rituals. Ceremonial cacao is different from what we all know as processed chocolate, from its sourcing to the way it's prepared and consumed as a drink. My project is a 10,000 square meter house in Guatemala, where 40 people will stay for 6 months up to several years, and will be learning how to grow and process cacao, which can also be consumed daily or in ceremonies. The project sees as a ritual all the stages and processes and aims to blur the boundaries between the production, daily life, and ceremonies. The space is very much informed by some archetypes from the history of architectures where cacao was important. Cacao is special as it contains high levels of theobromine, a naturally occurring stimulant which uplifts the consumer. This is the fruit, which contains the beans, the main ingredient of chocolate. The research investigated the uses of ritualistic cacao in a sequence of different contexts. In some cases, cacao entailing rituals spatialize social structure, and this ceremonial object becomes a vessel for domination and hierarchy. In other cases, cacao reinforces community bonds and maintains autonomy for groups. Amongst Mesoamerican cultures, dating back to the Maya and Olmecs, cacao was sacred, the food of the gods, an offering during ceremonies, a drink for the elite. The way cacao was used amongst the Maya reinforced the exclusivity and power of their social structure. During their religious ceremonies, cacao was a means for the elite to show to the community who has the power, through elite feasts at the ruler's palace courtyards. Cacao was sacrificed and then consumed in order to communicate with the deities. The drink was prepared in secret at the back of the palace, ritually prepared and consumed. The architectures where rituals took place were symbolically charged as well. Mayan cities consisted of ceremonial centers surrounded by the commoners' houses and agricultural fields. The architectures reflected their cosmology, in which plazas symbolized their primordial sea, temples the sacred mountains, and the temples' entrances the caves to the underworld. Cacao was also central to cave rituals. Caves are liminal or boundary spaces, entrances to the underworld. Again, the ceremonies were led only by the priests and leaders who represented the whole community. They also modified natural caves to divide private from public space and establish ritual spaces. Stairs, platforms, terraces, small monolithic monuments were also added. We also see social structure being highlighted, with the male commoners cultivating cacao in the fields of the elite. The ritual of growing, however, brought them together in their daily life, as well as the women who, in a collaborative and ritualized way, processed the cacao in the central open kitchen of the village. Now we could be taken to the mid-16th century Mexico and the California missions, looking at another example where cacao becomes part of the larger mechanics of uprooting and re-territorializing the life of the native populations. At the same time, cacao becomes a regular therapeutic relief for missionaries who were in precarious situations, consuming it daily as a ritual and an antidote to their loneliness. In this example, however, enormous amounts of cacao were shipped from Mexico to California, so the consumers knew nothing about the production of the cacao, but at the same time depended on it. In contemporary times, cacao is the mechanism maintaining the community bonds of the Guna Indians, the indigenous people of Panama. They own and control cacao production, which is small, only for domestic and ceremonial use, and their social relationships are formed around cacao in two ways: through the knowledge and caring of the plants in practical means, and then through the ceremonies that they conduct during different points in their life cycle of a person. Lastly, we move on to modern cacao ceremonies in urban contexts, which emerged with neo-shamanism. They are performed in opposition to the materialism and everyday stresses. They take place anywhere, from cities like London to retreats in Mexico, and are usually paired with sound baths, breathwork, yoga, and dancing. This is a ceremony in a temple in a retreat in Tulum. And this is at the Mandrake Hotel in London, where I attended the ceremony. We gathered in a circle, set our intentions, drank the cacao, and then, with the guidance of the shaman, became our own therapists. In contrast to this modern ritualistic use, we cannot skip the status quo of chocolate. It has transformed from a highly treasured ingredient to a globally traded commodity found in any convenience store. Produced in a repetitive way in spaces meant for mass production. And there is also a great dichotomy between the cacao growing, the processing, and the consumption. It is grown elsewhere, processed elsewhere, and consumed elsewhere, with the consumer having no knowledge of its origin. One of the main drivers of the project were current tendencies. Workaway is a platform that allows volunteers to contribute a pre-arranged amount of time per day in exchange for lodging and food, which is provided by their host. Many hosts describe how they had the urge to change their way of life, living in big cities after many years to start cacao farms, as seen in the examples here. People who, however, have not left big cities seek for temporary escapes. In this matrix, we see a day in the lives of subjects from London who end up going to cacao ceremonies, yet also succumb to the status quo of chocolate. For example, a Londoner might still consume a chocolate from Pret, yet also feels the need to attend this ceremony after work at a yoga studio where cacao becomes a medicine. To conclude the research, it seems like people seek for the formality of the ritual, the guidance of the shaman, the community of like-minded people who gather to perform a common practice. But nowadays, these end up being mechanisms, so we just continue in the cycle of these very isolated forms of living, and it just allows us to kind of get away, retreat, escape for a moment, a day, a night, a week, and then go back to the same situation. But what if the retreat instead became not so much of a retreat, but actually taught people how to care for, plant, and make cacao? This is the question I began this project with. And what if this architecture borrowed some of the paradigms that can give birth to control and hierarchy and provide a center or communal space, such as the platforms and the plazas of the Maya or the courtyards or plazas of the missions? Seeing cacao as a vessel to form everyday rituals, social relationships, and new forms of living, the project proposes a 10,000 square meter house in Guatemala for 40 people to stay for 6 months up to many years, where they will be cultivating, processing, and consuming cacao. The site is located in Lanquin, Guatemala, whose population is mostly of Mayan descent. It is close to the city, yet at a very sparsely populated area along Cahabon River, where the land is optimal for cacao cultivation. The design process started by learning from the typical cacao processing spaces, aiming to use and manipulate them by blurring boundaries and making them part of the daily life. The first space of the ritual is the cacao forest. Cacao is cultivated under agroforestry practices where many species are planted together with cacao, often in a specific layout. Harvesting happens twice a year and is a process of approximately 2 weeks. Next, the beans are fermented in fermentation centers, a process which lasts between 3 to 8 days. The beans are covered in banana leaves or jute bags and stirred every 48 hours. Next, the beans are dried on trays under the sun, then stored in warehouses. And lastly, to produce ceremonial cacao, beans are cleaned and roasted, then follows the process of cracking and winnowing, and lastly, they are ground to form a paste. Going back to the project, the overall space is informed by archetypes from the research: the plaza, the mountain, the platform, and the cave. Ambivalent spaces of hierarchy but also community, spaces of invention and unprescribed communal life. The plaza is surrounded by the factory, consumption space, kitchens, and cacao processing facilities, allowing for everyday activities to spill into adjacent production spaces. The mountain is a series of platforms, and inside there is storage and space for large gatherings. All around we have the cacao forest, within which there are sleeping areas to provide a level of privacy for the long stays. The landscape is formed in such a way to lead activity to the river on the lower part, to bathe after a tiring day in the fields or sit on small tables for more private time. And on the upper part, the landscape leads to the cave, where, for example, dark ceremonies can take place. The structure has different levels of porosity and is made of local materials and mainly bamboo. The factory space is surrounded by the plaza on one side and the cacao forest on the other, with a paved buffer zone. With seasonality, the domestic space around the structure might be organized in a completely different way. Meals can be organized during breaks from work or ceremonies, which can also spill into the factory at a period when it is not being used. This is a view from the plaza during a seasonal event where people have an evening ceremony and then gather and sleep in the plaza after work in the fields and factory. We can see traces of such activity even on the steps right in front of the factory. On a day of planting or harvesting, people can take breaks together within the fields, sit and chat on those tables, organize meals, sleeping, and events inside or around the farm. To conclude, the aim of the Cacao House is to provide more and less distinct architectures that allow for the production of cacao, of domestic space, and of ritual. A place where people hang on to the knowledge of growing and processing, learning how to care, and then forming their social relationships based on the cacao production.